So let's talk a little about amnesia. You're probably familiar with the idea from movies and pop culture, even if you've never experienced it in anyone close to you. Amnesia is a severe loss of memory, but specifically it's a loss of explicit memory, aka declarative memory, which you'll remember is like our semantic memory for facts and knowledge, plus our episodic memory for reliving specific events. But it turns out there are different types of amnesia. So the first is probably most familiar since it shows up in dozens and dozens of movies. It's what we'd call retrograde amnesia. With retrograde amnesia, the patient can't recall old memories. They lose access to information from before the brain trauma. Like after a serious head injury or sometimes a seizure or a stroke or an infection or degenerative brain disease, a person with retrograde amnesia might lose access to even basic autobiographical information like their own name or their family members, to events that happened in the past, maybe facts they used to know, and so on. Depending on the damage, this can sometimes be partial or apply more to one category of information than another. Like if there's more damage to certain temporal lobe areas, maybe semantic memory can be more heavily impaired and prior facts and knowledge become more out of reach. But other areas of the brain, like some in the frontal cortex, are really important for mediating retrieval of information from your personal past. And so damage to those kind of areas might cause more problems with episodic and autobiographical memory. Either way, with pure retrograde amnesia, the patient can make new memories. They can remember everything that's happened since the brain trauma, but old information is out of reach. That's where the term retrograde comes from. Retro means old, right? So this is amnesia for old information. Thankfully, this type of amnesia often recovers over time, and usually oldest memories come back first and more recent memories come back last, though of course the events a little prior to the trauma may never have been consolidated at all in the first place, so those may never come back. Now the other main type of amnesia is anterograde amnesia. Antero means front or forward. So this is an inability to form new explicit memories from the time of the brain damage onward. So your amnesia is for events forward in time from the damage. So it's anterograde. Generally, this happens if the hippocampus is damaged or if it's removed, because remember the hippocampus is essential for consolidating new memories into a lasting state. It also happens with, for example, Korsakov's syndrome, which is something that can happen with major long-term alcoholism where someone gets a lot of their calories from beer or other alcohol and ends up with a nutritional deficiency that can lead to neurotransmitter problems. Basically, serotonin and acetylcholine, they're involved in quite a few memory processes. So that's another way someone can get anterograde amnesia. Basically, the neurotransmitters in the hippocampus aren't working right. So with anterograde amnesia, consolidation is what's failing. You're kind of permanently trapped in the present 30-second snippet of working memory or whatever's currently in your mind. So you keep having experiences, but they don't get laid down in the brain. So anyone you meet stays a stranger forever. You'll actually see a somewhat inaccurate version of this in the movie 50 First Dates with Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore, where each day she wakes up and forgets what happened the prior day. But that's not quite right, because in the movie, she remembers things throughout the day. And that would mean her long-term memory is kind of functioning somewhat. Whereas in reality, someone with anterograde amnesia won't even remember the conversation they had 3 minutes ago. Like once the topic has changed, or if they've been interrupted briefly with something else for just a few moments, then they forget it all. So a much more accurate depiction is in the movie Memento by Christopher Nolan, who also did Inception and such. But in real life, our knowledge of anterograde amnesia comes from patients like H.M., who's probably the most famous case study in psychology, who actually contributed to decades of research into memory. We'll talk about him more in a minute, but from research on him and others with anterograde amnesia, we've discovered some really interesting things about memory. So, for example, typically with anterograde amnesia, implicit memory isn't affected much, meaning the person can create new implicit memories, they can learn new skills, and likewise things like priming still happen. It's just an issue with making new explicit or declarative memories. Also, the fact that someone with anterograde amnesia can't form new explicit memories but can retrieve old ones means that encoding into long-term memory and retrieving back out of long-term memory must be mediated by distinct systems. Like, we don't need the hippocampus to retrieve old memories, but we do need it to lay down new memories. That's something we learn from patients with anterograde amnesia. Now here's a video clip of another well-studied patient who has anterograde amnesia. His name is Clive Waring. So you can kind of see what it's like for him, but also for his family members.
One man is consigned to live entirely within the present, with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory, and sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence.
I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently in New Zealand. And so they're having a party.
Funny how the ladies acquire a different title when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace.
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know? Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married in... Do you know what country she just got married in?
No, I don't.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question and he'll give you an answer, but while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is.
I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You want to see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to now?
No.
Guess what you think they're up to.
No idea, I couldn't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They hadn't got an O-level last time I was conscious. So I didn't know what possible thing they could do, did I?
No.
No, I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No idea. I don't know where I am.
Yep.
All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before, never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive, day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time. Oh, look, it's come. Oh, you're wonderful.
That was a very musical kiss. I'm dizzy. I don't know which part of the room I'm standing in.
Can we dance?
So you can clearly see Clive has anterograde amnesia. He can't put down new memories. He can't consolidate things and remember what's happened to him. In Clive's case, he actually also has some retrograde amnesia too. So his hippocampus was damaged. It was actually by an infection of herpes encephalitis, but it did cause some more widespread issues with the central nervous system. So he also got some retrograde amnesia. But like when he goes out to eat, he can remember the name of what he's eating, like that's chicken, but he can't associate it with the taste. So like once he's chewing it, he forgets what he's eating. He can't ever learn the names of his doctors, but he can learn new procedural memory skills through like things like repetition, and he can make some other implicit memories. Like at one point, the doctors showed him the same video over and over and over again. And even though he never remembered the video, he had no idea what's in it, he unconsciously showed some anticipatory responses for things that were about to happen in the video. So his brain had been storing some memory, but implicit memories or things that aren't available to conscious awareness. He was a musician before the infection, and even though he can't explicitly recall musical pieces, by name or anything like that, put him in front of a piano and he can play smoothly and sight read, because that's implicit long-term memory, not explicit. Now, one thing amnesic patients have helped confirm is a double dissociation between short-term or working memory and long-term memory in the brain. So for a long time, there was actually a debate about whether long-term memory is really a separate system from short-term memory, or whether it's all just kind of a continuous spectrum. But amnesic patients provide us with at least one half of a double dissociation. So like with anterograde amnesia, people like Clive Waring and patient HM, they have normal functioning short-term memory. Like their working memory is fine, but they have impaired long-term memory. On the other hand, we've got patients with damage to other areas in the brain, like near the left parietal lobe, for example. Like there's a patient named KF who had a perfectly functioning long-term memory, but impaired short-term memory. Basically, KF had just incredibly poor digit span, not much recency effect for lists, and all those other things that go along with short-term or working memory. But KF could form and consolidate new long-term memories because the hippocampus was fine. So together, sets of patients like this help us confirm that these are in fact distinct systems, even at the neural level, and that's led to a lot of further work by cognitive neuroscientists that investigates the biological basis of things like working memory and long-term memory and how they're distinct in the brain. Now, meanwhile, speaking of patient HM, who we now know, by the way, his name is Henry Malazan. We found out after he died in 2008. But back in 1953, he was just a guy in his 20s who happened to have pretty bad epilepsy, which the doctors had tracked to inner parts of his temporal lobes on both sides, so the medial temporal lobes on both sides, right near the hippocampus. So at 27, he had some surgery and they removed a lot of his hippocampus, as well as some surrounding areas on both sides, just kind of near his inner temporal lobes. And it worked decently for the epilepsy. It did help him, but had a really unexpected side effect. He could no longer make new memories, meaning he had anterograde amnesia. He also happened to have some retrograde amnesia as well, having lost a lot of episodic memories from like the decade prior to surgery, although he remembered his childhood and his adolescence, and he could remember facts. So like old pre-surgery semantic knowledge, that was fine. And he could remember skills. So he hadn't lost his implicit memory or anything. But being unable to learn new things or make new memories, his activities of daily living were pretty limited. And he actually lived in a care institute in Connecticut for decades and decades until his 80s when he died in 2008. And during that time, his doctors and neuropsychologists, they researched, they studied, they tested his condition. Tons of articles were published about him, really adding to our basic understanding of memory. Now, I've mentioned before that one of the reasons neuropsychological patients are not the perfect way to deduce brain function is because the damage is rarely located in one specific well-defined area. So it's a little harder to conclude things about what that area of the brain does from a single patient's symptoms. And in HM's case, he's often talked about as someone who's missing the hippocampus, which is true. Most of his hippocampus was removed and the rest seemed to have kind of atrophied away, which is generally correct. But in fact, he also had some surrounding cortex removed and other limbic system damage, like the amygdala was removed on both sides. Now, after the surgery, they realized he had profound anterograde amnesia. He could not commit new episodic events to memory, and he had trouble forming new semantic knowledge. So like new explicit memories just couldn't consolidate without him having a hippocampus. Even years and decades later, he had no recollection of anything after the surgery in 1953. He didn't know his parents were dead. Every time researchers and doctors explained the significance of his condition and how important his case was to the scientific community, like he never remembered that later. He didn't know words that had entered the lexicon after his injury. Like he could do crossword puzzles. In his later life, he liked to do crossword puzzles, but he could only fill in with answers with kind of old pre-1953 knowledge. Or occasionally he could partially modify or update some details of a fact if it was part of an old pre-injury fact that he had already learned. But okay, that's what was impaired in HM. Now the question is, what was still intact despite having such an important part of his brain missing? And neuropsychologists like Suzanne Corkin and Brenda Milner and his surgeon, William Scoville, and others, they studied a whole range of brain functions to better understand his condition. So his perception was normal, his speech was normal, and his understanding of language was mostly normal. His intelligence was actually above average, so it hadn't caused any sort of universal decline in cognitive capacity or anything. And his immediate memory, in other words, his working memory, was intact. He had a normal digit span, so he could, repeat back a handful of random numbers he had just seen or heard, and he could carry on a conversation. He could keep track of the information briefly while it was still in his mind. So, as I mentioned before, we've got evidence that working memory and long-term memory are truly distinct systems. But also, HM helped us understand that kind of the different types of long-term memory. He helped confirm that explicit and implicit memory rely on distinct brain systems. So his ability to retrieve words, that shows that lexical memory, like our word memory, what words mean, doesn't require those areas that were removed in his brain. So it's relatively independent of those kind of intermedial temporal structures or the hippocampus, right? So not only could HM remember old skills he had learned from before the accident, but he could learn new skills and procedures. For example, they had him do a mirror drawing task where you draw something while looking at it indirectly. This is surprisingly hard, by the way. You can try it at home. Just block your direct view of the paper. It's pretty tough. So when he first started, he made lots of errors, as we all do. But across a single day's trials, he improved, even though he didn't remember the earlier trials by the time he was doing the later ones. So you can see the errors per trial going down on the graph here for day 1, right? And then they came back on day 2 and just did the same thing. Some more practice with this. Now, they had to explain the task to him from scratch, and he did not remember it at all on a conscious, explicit level. He had no explicit memory of doing this the day before. But sure enough, even his first trial on day 2 had half the errors of his prior day, right? And by the time they repeated this on the third day, he was pretty great at mirror drawing, despite saying he had never done it before. Likewise, HM showed effects of priming, like on a repetition priming task, and also he could make new associations through things like classical conditioning, because that's also implicit memory, right? So in fact, at one point, a doctor came in wearing one of those joy buzzer devices that shocks you a little when touched, and just introduced himself by shaking HM's hand and causing an annoying shock. Basically just a slightly painful little prank, right? But what's interesting is after doing this, HM would not remember that person explicitly, had no recollection of the episode. But when that person returned to the room in the future, later on, HM was kind of hesitant to shake his hand without understanding why. So an implicit memory association had formed, even though no episodic memory had consolidated, which tells us implicit memory like this must work very differently from how new episodic and semantic memories are formed in a way that requires hippocampal activity for those latter ones, right? So Henry Molaison and neuropsych patients like him, they really helped us understand how complex memory is and how the different memory systems, relate to each other and how they differ from each other. By the way, plenty of studies are still being done with people who have anterograde amnesia. Just to take one example, there's a 2010 study that kind of hints that emotion memory might be partially distinct from the explicit memory systems like semantic and episodic memory. So they had anterograde amnesia patients watch a comedic film clip or a tragic film clip, like a sad one, and then wait 5 or 10 minutes, after which they gave them a memory test for the clip they just watched. Now, most of the participants, the ones who have anterograde amnesia, most of those participants had no factual memory or no recognition about the clip. In other words, no explicit memory of the clip. They didn't remember seeing it, anything like that. They had not formed an explicit memory, but along with the memory test, the researchers also measured the patient's emotional state. So they did this like after showing the clip, immediately, they did it before the clip, just a pre-test, but then immediately after showing the clip, and then just after the memory test, so again, this is 5 or 10 minutes after they'd seen the clip, so this is still a long-term memory timeline, right? And then they did it 30 minutes later, a sort of final rating of what's your emotional state and how much do you remember of the thing. So if you look at the data here, this happens to be for the SAD clip condition, but the red bar, that's amnesic patients. The blue bar is just control participants, but red is those who have anterograde amnesia. There is no significant difference in sadness ratings on the far left here after watching the clip. If it's just immediately after watching, then everyone's kind of equally sad, which makes sense. They just watched it. But when we measure their emotion a while later, after a delay, after the memory test, or even after a 30-minute final wait, their explicit memory of the clip might be totally missing right? They have anterograde amnesia. They don't remember watching the clip. But their emotion rating is actually showing a lingering effect here that's surprisingly quite high, even more affected, even more of a lasting effect than the control participants. Which means that emotional processing part of the brain, right, it's still retaining something from that past event 10 or 30 minutes ago, even though they don't, consciously remember seeing any sort of sad film clip. And the implication here is really important, not just for people with anterograde amnesia due to injury or infection, but also conditions like dementia. This might suggest that things which can affect the mood of, say, someone with Alzheimer's in a care facility, that mood can kind of linger, even if they don't remember an event. Note from the data here that the sadness stuck around, but specifically it stuck around more in the amnesia patients than anyone else. So perhaps because they can't identify the source to deal with it. So they've got the lingering feeling, but without an identified source to make sense of. This would suggest that, things like routine neglect in nursing homes could be leading to continuing low mood over time, which could be worse because the source isn't identified and dealt with. So understanding these basic cognitive systems can have some important implications at the level of everyday care and help for people whose memory systems are impaired in some way. At any rate, that's enough for our brief tour of the biological side of memory. In the next video, we're going to talk a little more about different kinds of memory failure other than amnesia. So like things that are more widespread, mundane, everyday failures of our own memory that apply to all of us.